as fighting once again rages in Africa's newest nation. The question is why? South Sudan, which 5 years ago celebrated independence, enduring a fifth day of shooting despite calls for calm by rival leaders. How much of a handle do Salva Kiir and Riek Machar have on their forces, which are once again targeting civilians, but also the UN with claims of a government tank firing on Chinese armored personnel carrier, killing 2 Chinese peacekeepers? What reaction from the UN and from China, which has some 1,000 blue helmets in a country where it also pumps oil? We're going to be looking at regional players and interest more broadly, 5 years on, as the nation faces prospect of Civil War Act 3 with more than 1 million displaced. Was independence worth it? If not, what's the international community going to do about it? Part 2 of the France 24 debate, we're wondering if it is a return to civil war. And joining us from Dubai, journalist Simona Fulton, recently back from South Sudan. Thank you for being with us. Most residents of South Sudan's capital pinned down by gunfire and heavy explosions amid a 5th day of shelling. Diptyque Laurent has more.
Opposite the Christmas tree at the Rockefeller. South Sudan's President Salva Kiir signed a peace deal in Juba with this warning to his African counterparts.
We will sign this document, but I warn you, you regional leaders, to stand with us in the implementation. Otherwise, we may spoil it if it is left to us.
The deal was meant to end a 2-year civil war in South Sudan that killed tens of thousands of people and left millions displaced. Yet, this weekend, as the country prepared to celebrate the 5th anniversary of its independence, supporters of President Kiir clashed with rebels backing Vice President Riek Machar. Salva Kiir and Riek Machar were at the origin of South Sudan's civil war. They were locked in a battle for political leadership. Kiir accused Machar of plotting a coup against him in December 2013. He sacked Machar as his deputy, and a full, blown-out ethnic war broke out. Machar fled the country as ethnic Nuer rebels loyal to him went to war against Kiir's ethnic Dinka supporters. Last April, Machar agreed to return to the government as part of the peace deal. The latest violence, however, is yet another threat at a time when its population is already suffering from famine and has seen the production of its biggest export, oil, diminish.
Simona Fulton, the latest word we're getting out of Juba is that there were calls for immediate ceasefires by both Salva Kiir and his Vice President Riek Machar, the 2 rivals there. And it sounds as though they're being ignored. How much of a handle do they have on the situation?
Well, that is indeed a very good question. I think we've seen it throughout the conflict, which has lasted over 2 years now, that on both sides you have very unruly armies which consist of commanders which have their own goals and objectives. Some of them are more hardliners than President Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar. So it's very difficult for these 2 men to really make sure that their orders are implemented by their troops. And these are armies that are not very well trained. They have a lot of long-lasting grievances and distrust towards the other groups. So they're very, very difficult to control.
Very difficult to control. How do you explain the fact that we've had this resurgence of violence now?
Well, it's something that a lot of people have seen coming for a while in Juba. Back in April, when we had the return of the first Vice President Riek Machar to Juba alongside his forces, which was part of the peace deal that was signed in August, many people were worried that the presence of these 2 forces in the capital could spark renewed fighting. And this is exactly how the conflict started back in December. We had this fallout between forces loyal to President Kiir and forces loyal to Vice President Riek Machar in December within the Presidential Guard. And this is in the end what sparked the entire conflict. So there was a lot of concern that bringing Machar's forces back and having these two antagonistic forces who are poorly trained, who don't trust each other back in the capital, that it was really just a question of time until something broke loose.
Really a question of time, and we saw that there was this joint press conference with the two leaders at the end of last week, and one person who wasn't there was the chief of general staff to Salva Kiir, Paul Malong. He is the former governor of northern Bahr el Ghazal state. He didn't attend, and many people are wondering if the regional leaders that are below the two top guys just want to keep on fighting.
Well, and this is a very good question you raise, and many will in fact question whether the chief of the army, Paul Malong, is in fact below Salva Kiir, or whether he's in the end the one who is calling the shots. This is a general who is extremely powerful, who is responsible for orchestrating much of the civil war in South Sudan, and who is considered one of the hardliners. I mean, if we go back to August, when President Salva Kiir didn't sign the agreement in Addis Ababa because he had to go back to Juba to consult with some of the people in his government and the army, Paul Malong was seen as one of the main people who was opposed to this peace deal. And I've spoken to a member of the opposition today in Juba, and he in fact said that he believes that even if the president is well-intentioned to stop the fighting, that there are hardline elements, such as Paul Malong, who may not be inclined to put an end to this.
All right, at this point in time, let's bring in Norwegian, he's a former executive director of the UN Environmental Program and a former diplomat who's negotiated peace deals in other contexts. Erik Solheim, many thanks for being with us from Abu Dhabi. This sounds like a real mess. You have two leaders calling for ceasefire in South Sudan, and the people below them aren't listening. What do you do?
This is extremely sad. I mean, yesterday it was 5 years since we were dancing in the streets of Juba. There was such a promise. The liberation movement, SPLM had won, and 99.999 in the referendum had called for a separate state of South Sudan. We were all happy, so were the people there. And there was one of the biggest parties I've ever been to. And now 5 years later, it's such a sad situation. They have not done what we all expected, to build a nation, to start a hard, long-term work on building a nation, improving education, health, roads, exactly what the people of South Sudan need. And rather than doing that, they ended up fighting each other.
Was the writing on the wall, the fact that that ceremony that you mentioned from 5 years ago, they declare independence before state institutions had been created?
But there was no other way of doing it, because I mean there was such a demand for a separate state. As you know, the referendum got 99.98 or something like that for independence. So there was no other way of doing it. But what we all expected from the international community was for the president, the vice president, and all the other leaders, also bridging the divide between the two main groups of the Dinkas and the Nuers, to come together to start the long-term, slow, somewhat boring work of building a nation, rather than starting quarreling on, in reality, relatively small issues, which I think nearly everyone in South Sudan, that's not what they want. They want nation building.
They want nation building. The leader, the longtime historic leader of the SPLA, who died in a helicopter crash in mysterious circumstances, John Garang, he was somebody who advocated a federal state. He didn't advocate independence. Hindsight being 2020, when you see what's transpired since with local, I guess we could almost call them warlords with their own interests. It sounds like, is this the UN's problem now to piece this back together?
The UN and the international community, of course, must assist the people and the leaders of South Sudan on bringing the nation back on track. The regional mechanism with nations like Ethiopia, Sudan, Uganda, and others, the so-called ICAD, so of course the core of the peacemaking. The United Nations have troops on the ground. Fortunately, none of them have been non-UN staff that have been attacked, as far as I know. The UN and the international community will do its very, very best to assist. But at the end of the day, no international actor can bring peace to South Sudan. Only Salva Kiir, the president, and Riek Machar, the vice president, and their core supporters can bring that peace to the nation of South Sudan.
Simona Fulton, do you agree there is no regretting independence? It was the only way to go?
Well, I think there is certainly a more nuanced way of looking at that. I mean, as you mentioned, John Garang had a very different vision for Sudan, and unfortunately, after he died, that vision was not pursued further. And even though it is true that the overwhelming majority of the South Sudanese voted for independence, it could have been maybe implemented in a different way. And I think what is really important to say is that the international community really has to take a hard look at themselves, because in the end, they are the ones that nurtured the SPLM, the liberation movement, in the struggle against Sudan. Both morally and militarily, they provided support, including Norway, for example, and the United States. And they did so in a very unconditional manner, because they looked at their SPLM, the liberation movement, as the good guy in the struggle against the Islamist government in Khartoum. And that led them to adopt, a very optimistic point of view, I would say, where they didn't really question the ideology of the movement. They didn't really hold them to account for their undemocratic ways, for atrocities committed. And they very much focused on just one objective, getting independence. And they forgot that you can't really have independence without having a state, without having institutions. And that's where we are today.
I wanted to ask you, Simona, we heard at the outset in that report that signing of a fresh peace deal a little under a year ago, where we heard President Salva Kiir saying, we signed the documents, but I warn you African leaders to stand with us in the implementation. Who is he referring to in particular?
Well, it's unclear exactly who he was referring to. I mean, he had obviously the support of Uganda throughout the conflict, and Ethiopia also played a big role. But I think more than anything, he was just really voicing his reservation to this agreement. It was just so evident that both him and, in fact, also Riek Machar had some very strong reservations about this agreement. And it's a little bit strange because, on the other hand, both really oppose the involvement of the international community and of other countries. For example, when it comes to things like bringing about justice, they both oppose the involvement of the ICC or any international court in bringing, those responsible for atrocities to account. They have also, to some extent, at least the president and his office in a recent New York Times op-ed opposed the creation of a hybrid court that was embedded in the peace deal. So on the one hand, they want support in terms of finances. They probably want support in terms of military equipment. But at the same time, they don't really want any meddling in their own affairs when it comes to bringing about justice. So it's not entirely clear.
Don't want any meddling when it comes to their own affairs. 6 senior figures from both sides are under UN sanctions. Does that in part explain, Erik Solheim, why we had this shooting at a UN armored personnel carrier vehicle killing those 2 Chinese peacekeepers?
I am not in Juba, and I am not really knowing the exact situation there, so I will refrain from commenting upon that. I think the main issue now is to very, very, very strongly call upon the 2 leaders and their core supporters to immediately come to a cessation of hostilities, to stop all sort of violence in Juba. Fortunately, it seems that it has not spread to other parts of South Sudan, so that at least some consolation. Get them into that and to make the national coalition government work. There is no way you can have a government without both the Nuers and the Dinkas and other communities, and by extension by Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. So let's assist them in coming back to peace and to start nation building. And what I can offer on behalf of UN Environment is that we will be partners to the coalition government of South Sudan in restoring environmental impact by the war, and also looking into how environmental degradation has amplified the problems which are underlying the conflict. But We can only assist them, but they must now rise to the occasion and deliver peace.
Erik Solheim, how do you explain the fact that you have the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon who's calling for an arms embargo? There is not an arms embargo. Apparently Russia is against it, or has been so far in the past. How do you explain that?
I think South Sudan, fortunately, are among the conflicts on the planet where there is least international interference in a negative way and least conflict between the main actors. I mean, in reality, all the main stakeholders in the international community, the United States of America, Russia, China, Europe, and all the local actors, I mean, the key actors in the region, they're all calling for peace. None of them see their interest sustained by continued conflict. So while the international community is playing a negative role in many other conflicts, here it's the local actors which must take the full responsibility for what we see. They must bring peace, and then I think everyone is ready to support them. And as I said, on my part, I can offer support in the area of the environment.
Simona Fulton, the arms embargo, is it a good idea? Why hasn't it happened sooner?
Well, I asked the same question to the UN Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan, Donald Booth, in Addis Ababa not long ago, and he said, well, we want to prioritize the peace agreement. We don't want to derail the peace deal. We want to make sure that we move ahead. And, you know, the United States didn't really push for the arms embargo or for further sanctions against Machar Kiir themselves, because they thought that this would simply, you know, stop the progress in implementing the peace deal, which clearly didn't work, as we see from the events of the last few days. And also they said that, you know what, in the end, China and Russia would vote against such an embargo in the Security Council. But in the end, the U.S. didn't really try very hard to push for that embargo themselves. And of course, it comes down to, you know, various interests in South Sudan. It comes down to different spheres of influence. China has a lot of business interests there, Russia less so. But, you know, the countries have different interests, and it's difficult to see them align themselves on an issue like this. It will be interesting to see whether the events of the last few days will change that.
Yeah, will they change it? Most notably in the case of China, with their own peacekeepers targeted, Simona.
That is a very interesting development. It will probably follow. I mean, what I find interesting is that the Chinese actually engaged in the fighting, which is something relatively rare for UN peacekeepers in South Sudan. They have been repeatedly accused of, you know, not confronting armed actors whenever civilians are under attack. And China was one of the later countries to contribute peacekeepers to South Sudan. A lot of people think that that was the case to safeguard their own business interests. So it will be very interesting whether this will change anything. But I think one thing that is positive to note is that Chinese peacekeepers actually engaged when they were attacked.
What about Uganda, which is the neighboring state? It's the oil pipeline runs through Uganda. Simona Fulton, what role is Uganda playing? Are they part of the solution or part of the problem?
Well, so Uganda was on the side of the South Sudanese government when the conflict first erupted. They were critical in stopping the advance of the rebels on the capital, Juba, in January 2014, and essentially helped recapture strategic towns like Bor. As part of the peace deal that was signed in August 2015, they were supposed to withdraw, which they did in October last year. And I think the comments that we've heard coming out of Kampala is that they have no intention of really re-engaging in South Sudan, even though the commanders at the time when they were withdrawing, they said, we will make sure that Uganda's own interests are preserved. But it's difficult to see whether they will actually redeploy troops into the country, because I think in the end, they were quite happy to actually get out of this rather messy conflict.
Happy to get out of this messy conflict. Erik Solheim, again, the question is, going forward now, preventing an Act 3 of the civil war, what's the way to quickly put out the fire?
That is for Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, the two main leaders, to immediately put a stop to fighting from their supporters. And I mean, hardly any doubt that they can do it. I mean, you can find any excuse, but they can do it. Let them get the fire turned off, and then the international community stand ready to support. And I have to defend the Chinese, for instance. I think they have played a utterly constructive role in the conflict of South Sudan. They have no major big economic interest there, as people tend to believe. They want peace, and the same is what Americans and others want. And remind yourself, this was the first conflict in the world where China employed a special peace envoy to assist the peace process. So the conflict is not fueled from abroad, as some other conflicts. I mean, like say in Syria, where there is a huge component of fuel coming in from abroad, while in South Sudan it's basically fueled from within. And the international community, by and large, with very few exceptions, if any, stand ready to support. But the 10 million people of South Sudan deserve a strong leadership who stop the war and join hands. They may not like each other, they may not want to marry each other or go to a hotel or a club together, but they need to be able to work together and to start the long-term building of schools, hospitals, whatever. Remind yourself, this is a nation where hardly any child now embark upon school, which has the among the worst healthcare system in the world, where there's malnutrition. It's one of the poorest places on the planet. It will take, even under the best of circumstances, many years to develop up to, say, a level of Ethiopia or Kenya or Uganda, some of the neighboring nations. So they must start tomorrow to get this done. All
right, the onus on the leaders there from Erik Solheim, who many thanks for joining us from Abu Dhabi. I want to thank as well Simona Fulton in nearby Dubai. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And it's been a news-intensive Monday. We say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
We didn't get to draw the curtain on Euro 2016. Fortunately, you're here.
Well, that's right. And on social media, it's still a topic of to conversation and reaction. None other than Cristiano.
For decades to come, if
well,
you're Portuguese.
Maybe so. Maybe right up to the next Euro. Cristiano Ronaldo, obviously enough, tweeting images of the celebrations down south in Portugal, such as you have images such as this coming from, I imagine, the streets of Lisbon, and jubilation all round. Meanwhile, Francois, it's quite a different picture in France, as this headline in Le Monde suggests, a spoiled party. And indeed, the country was ready to party. Everybody really thought that it was going to go the way of France. You had people who were taking days off work on Monday, etc. And they do, a lot of them have.
And there was the story of this bus. They had apparently a team bus that said European champions on it.
That's right. They were paid. I suppose they were thinking we should just prepare it anyway for what is the inevitable win, and it's a little bit embarrassing. Anyway, there's also lots of comments on Twitter about hangovers. I suppose people were out watching the match on a Sunday evening, probably having a drink or two, and that's quite literal. I'm sure many people do have a hangover, but also, of course, it is a metaphor for the disappointment. What else do we have? There's this video that is sort of bringing a smile to many people's faces. It is in the Stade de France after the match. According to Euronews, it's the very best of football. You can see a dejected-looking French fan and a young Portuguese fan giving him a hug, Francois.
Oh, that's nice.
Isn't that nice? I suppose it doesn't necessarily change the result, but that video has been getting tens of thousands of shares, if not hundreds of thousands of shares at this stage on social media. So there you go. I'm not sure if we have a huge amount of time, but there's also, of course, Griezmann winning the best player of the competition. I suppose a little bit of a
consolation prize.
A little bit of a consolation prize, indeed.
Consolation prize for Griezmann, who's got Portuguese roots, by the way.
Oh, well, there you go.
And some have been trying to put this in perspective.
That's right. Well, I guess we'll finish with this headline in Slate, because, of course, a lot of people unhappy about the situation. Look, Les Bleus didn't save the nation. They were actually there just to play football. So some people saying, was there a little bit too much pressure, a little bit too much expectation on the French football team to sort of raise the morale of a country that has indeed had a lot of bad news in the last year?
I think, by the way, that they're entirely right, because people in France they're they're not distraught. I mean, they went to the final.
Right. And life does go on. Although this tweet here, I'm not sure how to interpret it. It's Monday, and Hollande is still the French president. Of course, François Hollande, his poll ratings aren't so high, but I'm not sure football can really change everything and anything, as Slate.fr points out.
Would not have been enough to save his current poll numbers, but James Creed
might have given him a little boost.
Oh, well, many thanks for that. And thank you for joining us here on the France 24 debate.